what's my like entry level, like what can I do to start supporting my vendors better? Like having clear handbooks and rules, doing a new vendor orientation, and then featuring them in some of your marketing, such as social media and stuff like that. Those are like really low-hanging fruit we found.
In this episode, Maura Henn, a community food systems specialist with NCAT's Western Regional Office in Butte, Montana, has a conversation with 3 representatives from the Oregon Farmers Market Association about the association's beginning vendor support network. Let's listen.
Hello, my name is Maura Henn, and I'm a community food systems specialist at the National Center for Appropriate Technology. Today I have with me 3 representatives from the Oregon Farmers Market Association to talk about their beginning vendor support network and their experiences with farmers market vendor support and development. Welcome. First, can each of you introduce yourself and describe your role with the Oregon Farmers Markets Association? Amanda, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Amanda Cross. I'm the programs manager at OFMA, and I started here in 2019, brought on to run the Beginning Vendor Support Network. Great, thank you. And Kelly?
Hi, I'm Kelly Crane. I'm the executive director for OFMA. I use she, her pronouns. And the BVSN was kind of my brainchild before we were lucky enough to find Amanda.
And hi, I'm Mallory Rahe. I'm an assistant extension professor now at the University of Missouri, but when we first started this project, I worked at Oregon State University.
Great, thank you. So my first question is, can you just share a little bit about what the Beginning Vendor Support Network is and what motivated you all to develop it?
It's a good question. I'll take that one. This is Kelly. Actually kind of start with the why we developed it. And that is because we all know that farmers markets are amazing business incubators, right? So they're an entry point to the local foods pipeline for these new agripreneurs. They have these really low barriers to entry. They've got low cost, not too much paperwork, and they're scale appropriate for these small and beginning producers. So they're this really good place to build brands, to test their products, to build capital, to build their business identity and relationships. So like, for example, a new jam maker can set up a booth at our local farmers market, and she can sample new flavors with her customers. She can perfect her sales pitch kind of in real time. She develops sourcing relationships with maybe berry vendors that she meets at the market. She builds that clientele before she ever even has to scale up and try to get her product into like a retail establishment, for example. So lots of new food and farm business owners get their start at farmers markets. Some of them stay forever, but many kind of graduate on to other business models later. But markets are kind of that first step in business incubation. So those who work within the farmers markets community, we all know this. It's really like a given. It's just really like embedded in everything that we know. And no, we haven't really spent as much time kind of proving that. So public perception, we realize, unfortunately, doesn't really align with that business incubation function. They kind of see markets as kind of fluffy and feel good without recognizing these like important economic functions that they serve. And so we noticed this disconnect in perception a few years ago and started trying to find evidence to address it. And we actually didn't find any. Dr. Rahe performed a lit review to look for any academic information. I reached out to a lot of folks that I knew in the farmers market world, and there just didn't seem to be any programs or studies kind of looking at this business incubation function. So there were plenty of articles on farmers market economics, but they were mostly like, you know, vendor sales, how much do vendors make at farmers markets, or the economic impact of a farmers market on the community surrounding it, you know, how many people spent money at other businesses on market day, that kind of stuff. But nothing on this business this business incubator function. So, nothing on the reasons why new vendors join markets, what their business goals are their markets helping meet those goals? Why do they leave or just expand from markets? What do they go on to do afterwards? So and also importantly, how markets can best support that function for new and beginning vendors. So we decided it was time to change that. That dearth of information. And so that's how the Oregon Beginning Vendor Support Network was kind of born. Which brings me to the what. So we started out designing, and Mallory really was influential in this too, designing this program to address this. So we kind of landed on this capacity building program designed to study and support the role of farmers markets as business incubators. So we developed this 5 market cohort, mostly small, mostly rural markets. And we developed a community of practice committed to improving their support that they were providing to new and beginning vendors. So markets, how are you helping your new and beginning vendors? How are you centering this purpose and focusing on it or not? So there's a strong training component built into this. So lots of technical assistance, but it's mostly around peer-to-peer learning, sharing of information. There is a little component with bringing in technical expertise, but a lot of it focuses on what already exists within the market community. There's a strong data collection component. So we pay our markets to do that. We don't just expect them to do it for free. They do daily sales reporting with every one of their vendors. They do at least annually market manager and vendor surveys. And we planned this big vendor interview series, but that was really disrupted by COVID. So we also funded market level initiatives, which markets were able to kind of customize and design projects to do at their markets in year 2 that were designed to meet their vendors' needs. So we're like, you know your vendors better than anybody. We've been talking about this for a year now. So what do you think you need to do at your market? What do you want to try? What strategy do you want to try? And so we funded those projects too. So the idea is to follow these 5 markets across 3 years, right? Study how they're supporting their new and beginning vendors, help them try some new things until they get better at this, and then see how that impacts everyone. And use that data collection to measure that. So, of course, COVID came along in year 2. So a lot of our best laid plans got disrupted. So a lot of what we ended up doing starting in year 2 was kind of pivoting to just help these markets survive the pandemic with the blessing of our funders. And our data set really turned into more of a before, during, and after snapshot of COVID's impact on farmers markets and vendors than it really did. Our data ended up measuring that more so than it did measuring our kind of project impacts, because nothing we were really going to do with these markets was going to act as strongly on their success as COVID did. So we didn't exactly do what we started out to do, but we have learned a lot of lessons and done a lot of really important stuff. So
great, thank you. So the program or the project is in its 3rd year and in the final year. Do you expect it's going to expand past that with an extension or anything because of COVID?
We have plans, and I know Amanda is going to talk about this a little more. We have plans for what the next phase of this work looks like, but the actual BVSN project will sundown at the end of this year and kind of morph like a beautiful butterfly, we hope, into something new, based on the lessons that we learned with this project.
And Kelly, you mentioned that the markets, the 5 market cohort that you're working with are mostly rural. Can you tell me a little bit more about what went into the decision about which markets would participate, and just a little bit more about that process and any requirements that were involved?
Yeah, because it was such a small group and because it was a capacity building or, kind of a pilot project, We had a small group, and so we just really leaned into some existing relationships. We support 100-ish markets in our state every year, and we have been around for a long time, so we have relationships with these markets, and we know them, we know their staff. So we really looked at, we knew we wanted to focus on rural-ish and smallish markets. And we wanted to have a good geographic spread. So with that in mind, we invited specific markets. We recruited them that fit the size, fit the location, and then that were ready to engage with this kind of work. So like small enough to need the support and benefit from it, but organized enough to participate successfully.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'm just curious about, what were the outcomes that you were looking to achieve with this project, and what are the participating markets? What were they hoping to see from the project?
This is Amanda. I'll take this one. So we wanted to just increase the body of knowledge around new and beginning vendor support strategies at farmers markets for Oregon, and to share out nationally. We're doing that with creating a community of practice for market managers and helping them to both see their own expertise and see each other as having expertise that they can go to, and having a culture where asking for help from each other is seen as beneficial and normalized. And so just increasing market managers' skill sets and giving them more confidence and helping them to be better decision makers. And we focus that on those 5 farmers markets that are part of the cohort, but because of the project, we were able to also get those training opportunities out to the rest of the state, and create partnerships with technical assistance providers. So bringing people in to do focused work on things like board governance and marketing and promotion and diversity, equity, inclusion. And of course, data collection, which was a huge part of the project. So getting these 5, some of the 5 farmers markets that were part of the cohort had done a little bit of data collection in the past, but we really increased the amount and systematized what they were doing. So vendor sales, getting them, vendor sales figures from every vendor at every market day, crowd counts a few times a season, but we kind of got them into doing it at least every month. And business goals surveys with the vendors at the beginning of the year, and then also some, especially after the end of 2020, asking them, how did your year go this year with everything that was going on? And just increasing that sense of collecting data and measuring impacts at markets so that you can make better decisions and really understand how your market is doing, and talking to your vendors about how they're doing. We also had the other outcomes were those initiatives that Kelly talked about, so that market managers could test out ways to support their vendors during the second year. And again, that fell right through the pandemic. So a lot of those things changed to be more, this is going to help us get us through the pandemic. So doing things like online pre-order systems. We had one market that had planned to do this like product sampling every week and food tasting with their new and beginning vendors, and that became not really possible to do. But they were able to make these really cool like take-home sample kits with those vendors. So there was still a way to help customers introduce these new vendors to their customer base. Let's see, what else do we do? A toolkit of resources that are available to all the markets in the state. Things like, again, on the sampling thing, we partnered with the Food Innovation Center, which is through OSU here to make this big sampling toolkit that was focused on 2 types of sampling. One, to like learn how to adjust your product and the recipe, getting that kind of feedback from your customers, and then also looking at like how to sample for marketing purposes. And we got that done right before the pandemic started. We had a winter market best practices for market managers. Oh, yes, all the analysis and reporting of taking in all that data, and then all the analysis and reporting that Mallory has been able to do for us, and understanding, helping our vendors helping our markets understand better what their sales figures and crowd counts are telling them. And then, yes, the big pandemic pivot that we weren't expecting, but we supported a lot of operational changes that kept markets viable and helped them address safety and protocol like that.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to be doing. And yeah, the taste testing, sampling, even though that kind of went out the window this last year with COVID, I'm sure those are going to be resources that will be utilized as things kind of progress into not being as restricted, and when things become more safe. And those sound like great tools. Mallory, did you want to speak a little bit about the data collection piece now, and what you've all seen now that it's in the 3rd year, and just maybe a little bit about that process and some of the maybe interesting things that you've all have learned through that data collection?
Sure. So I want to be clear that this was initially a tough sell for us. And to remind people that may not be aware, starting data collection at a market that's never done it before is a big lift that does require a lot of support. Changing this culture, changing this idea of what it means to be a vendor and what your expectations are, that's hard. And Kelly came in with a lot of experience in this area, but when this project started, there was not a strong existing culture of data collection at the Oregon farmers markets. So at the start of this project, we did have to break a lot of new ground, and it took the Oregon farmers market to really spend a lot of their social capital with these market managers to get them on board, and to not forget that we were paying people for this work. Like we had to have that carrot incentive and the funding to be able to implement this through external grants. It is a lot of work. The process took some trial and error. We ultimately were flexible, trying to meet everyone's needs. We had some original ideas of how it would go, and then we had to pivot a lot, just recognizing people's willingness to change, how far they were willing to go. We thought originally that vendors would take on a lot of this self-reporting, and it would be nice and clean, and it would go into one online system that would link to another online system, and that did not work. So we stepped back on the technology requirements and mostly relied on paper, emails. The market managers would have to do in-person follow-up with vendors sometimes to get to that structure and system. But despite all of the initial challenges and the reluctance, we've really seen the vendor buy-in improve a lot over time, and our markets are maintaining a very high reporting rate, better than 90% for nearly every market occurrence. But all of this is very subject to disruption, and we saw that. One of our market managers had to leave mid-season, and our data integrity slipped for a bit until we got a new staff member in place and trained. And I say we as in the project, but it was that individual market that was getting that position filled, and then us coming in with that knowledge and technical assistance and support to kind of get the data reporting restored. And so I think we've learned a lot from the data, but I think having the full 3 years, we'll be able to do a lot more. Because going into this, like Kelly said earlier, there's just simply not a lot out there that you can go find on vendor sales at farmers markets. Market managers have their assumptions, some very, rooted and grounded and good based on how familiar they are with their market. But our data collection process, I think, has taught managers new things about their market and revealed it confirmed some of their assumptions and then revealed new things as well. And Amanda mentioned earlier, we coupled our sales data tracking with some vendor survey data so that we could just learn more about the vendors. The farmers markets have a tremendous diversity of vendors who are there, why they're there, what are their intentions, are they trying to start a business, is this a social enterprise, a lifestyle, this is how I want to spend my Saturdays. It runs the gamut. And we really had a lot of questions about why are vendors here, and can we look at those vendors, can we start to separate and understand the vendors who are trying to build a business from other types of vendors. So I expect we'll have a lot more to say about that once we have 3 full years of data.
Can I add my favorite thing that we learned? You guys know what I'm about to say, don't you? So when Mallory was mentioning some assumptions that we've confirmed that were, again, that kind of like anecdotal market manager wisdom, we have confirmed through evidence. I'll give you an example of one. So in looking through our data and seeking to say, like, after year 1, like, okay, which of these new and beginning vendors, and so for us, we should say we define that with 3 years or less coming into a market season. It's not the 10 years or less that the federal government sometimes uses. So for us, we said 3 years or less before this market season and you're a newbie. So we tagged them at every market and we looked at their sales versus other more established vendor sales. We looked at their sales compared to each other, like within markets, across markets, all of these things. And we were looking for things that told us, like, indicators about which vendor behavior and market manager behavior and how that was contributing to their success or not. And so we found a lot of little things, but I'll give you an example of my favorite thing that we found. And that is, if you hear market managers orienting new vendors, they're like, you have to come every market occurrence. You have to, if we have a Saturday market, you have to come every Saturday. It's how you get to know your customers. They expect to see you there. You build your business. Don't skip a Saturday because you think it's going to be slow. It'll be bad for you. You really have to be there consistently. And vendors are always kind of like, yeah, but like, I don't want to come in this month because this month's slow. And so market managers experience, it's a source of tension, right? And so we confirmed with our data that not only, so the vendors that came more frequently, that were more reliably at the markets, not only did they make more money throughout the whole season than other types of vendors, and this held true across vendor types, right? But they also made more money at each market occurrence. So when you looked at their average sales for each market, every time you show up at the market, you make X amount of money. The ones that showed up more frequently made more money every single time, even showing up on the slow days. So we were like, finally, we've confirmed this thing that market managers have been trying to get their vendors to know. So that was like, just an example of one little thing that we've now we've proven it,
That's amazing, and has to feel so good to have those things confirmed. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about like the flexibility that went into the vendor data collection, and I was looking through your toolkit, and you shared some forms with our project in Montana, and I'm curious about that flexibility piece as far as did some markets adopt an anonymous vendor collection? Is it could you just talk a little bit about any issues around that and how you kind of went about solving those.
Yeah, so the data, once it comes into us, is anonymous for some of the markets. Obviously, the market managers with their vendors, they know who each other are, but one market, instead of doing the paper forms, they did create their own online survey through sort of like Google Forms. It's another service called Cognito. And so the vendors just go in there and turn in their sales figures weekly through that online form. Others were doing it through, like, they email them in every week. And some were just like, you have to track that vendor down, like at the market or through phone calls or whatever to get them. But you know, that, I mean, we know you can't get a totally perfect set, but we were trying for it because you have to get as much as you can. So I think our market managers really took it to heart to be pretty relentless about trying to collect as much as possible and getting full sets of information for each market day. And vendors eventually just got, I mean, we're just starting the third year of it, and the ones who are experienced and used to it they just do it now, and I think it's a lot easier for them. Let's see, does that answer your question about flexibility? Or
yes, it does answer my question. And I would imagine that maybe that first year was maybe a little bit more challenging, but in year 2 and 3, setting it as an expectation and having those conversations ahead of the market season, at those beginning market meetings, that vendors are coming into the season just already knowing that this is going to be an expectation of being part of that market. And I would assume that kind of helps set that precedent.
Yeah, when it's incorporated into like the application and the vendor handbook and the meetings that they have at the beginning, and here are your forms and here's how you fill them out, and this is the thing we're doing. And also reporting back to the vendors what the data said, like letting them know that there was a purpose to all of this and it went somewhere and something really cool happened with it. And here's new information to help you know how to have better success at your market. That reward gets people to, they want to help out when that happens.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that a lot with, any kind of surveys or data collection, that allowing people to have the option to opt in to, and like closing that circle of the information so that they know what the outcome was and how it's being used is really valuable to kind of create that trust in moving forward. Amanda, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the community of practice with the market managers and, with them utilizing each other as experts. In what ways are they doing that? I'm not sure where these markets are geographically within the state, so how close they are, how are they communicating? Have there been any interesting ways that they're doing that, and how did that change over the last year with the pandemic?
Oh yeah, they are days away from me. They are all over the state, the 5 markets, and it would take a week to go around and visit all of them. But they would meet monthly by conference call and talk. We would have an agenda. Sometimes we knew, like, it's a time of the year, we know, like, we're going to talk about applications, or we're going to talk about recruitment, or sometimes we'd let it be very driven by what issues came up for them, and have like a leadership dilemma is what we called it, where they would bring to the group an issue that they were having and explain what they had tried, and then try to get feedback. There's a very specific process that Kelly taught me how to use for doing those, of how you go through, and the market manager could talk about what they had already tried, and then the other market managers share what they heard, and then they go around again and get to share what their advice might be, and then the market manager who is getting the advice gets to share like what was helpful to them. And I noticed that our market managers would contact each other even not at these conference calls. I'd hear later that they had like emailed each other about we're having side conversations and things going on during the month, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want them to do. And I think that's one of the biggest tools we found, that as a market association, that's what we can offer to our membership. And so we started having these peer-to-peer calls with our entire membership. I mean, after COVID started as a way to bring everyone together to talk about how they were implementing COVID safety protocols, having Zoom meetings, and like, how are you figuring out how to have space between the right amount of space between vendors and your customers, and the extra hand washes you need to set up, and if you're on this kind of property, like how do you expand space if you're on city property, if your market's on a city street versus like private space on a parking lot or something like that. That is where we are going next with our next project, is just really finding ways to bring our markets together for learning from each other and getting expert training from the technical assistance providers that we're going to be bringing in.
So that is the kind of the next phase that Kelly was mentioning earlier about the next phase of this project is kind of expanding that community of learning, community of practice with all of the markets in the association.
One of the things we did keep hearing from our 5 market cohort in the Beginning Vendor Support Network is how much a lot of other market issues and needs go into supporting those beginning vendors. Market managers are everything. They're like HR person, they're the IT person at their market, they're the weather forecasters, they are often doing executive director type work, even though they're only called market managers. They're interacting with their boards, they're doing they run their volunteer programs, they're doing everything at their markets. And so we'd be talking about one thing, but it would always go into like all these other topics that they needed help with. And so we saw that goes into about like 4 different basic categories. And so the next project is going to include a lot more of the wraparound assistance that markets need to be effective. So things like organizational development, stuff, helping their boards understand their roles and job descriptions, financial and administrative help. We'll keep the new and beginning vendor support as one of the tracks. And then also marketing, branding, and promotion. That is often a place, again, where there's tension between the markets and the vendors. The vendors are like, why aren't you promoting me more? And the markets are like, why aren't you mentioning us in your promotions? So we want to find ways to help them work together on that. And then we're also putting in a diversity, equity, and inclusion track to make our, markets in Oregon, well, markets everywhere, agricultural systems have, racism is embedded in these systems, and we need to look at how our markets are set up and the policies and practices that are keeping BIPOC people from being able to participate as much as possible in these markets. And so that was another focus that we started bringing to the peer-to-peer calls also, like getting markets to talk about this and make changes to how they're run.
That's really exciting. I think one of the coolest things about these farmers market projects is seeing how they can be scaled to other states or other locations. Your Beginning Vendor Support Network project, I could see it happening in other states, but then also this expansion that you're talking about, especially the diversity, equity, inclusion piece, the marketing. I mean, I think that those are going to be issues that markets in any state looking to others for kind of setting that groundwork is so important. So thank you for doing that. And yes, farmers market network learning is really vital for all of the markets in the state and in Montana where I'm at. I'm just curious if you all would like to share, just maybe the biggest lessons learned so far and any advice you might have for markets looking to improve their vendor relationships before we close out our discussion.
Do you want me to,
Ellie?
Do you want me to choose one that I like?
Sure.
I think just the act of saying we're going to focus on this and centering that topic did a lot for our markets. Just having that attention and being like, this is going to be one of our market's strategic priorities for the next few years, and we're going to dedicate staff time, attention, funding to it. So just centering that and saying it out loud, writing it down somewhere, like making sure everybody knows, like that seemed to do a lot. The other thing I learned is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Somebody somewhere in your network has tried something that worked really well. So like, look at somebody else's, look at your neighboring markets, like handbooks, and see if they've got good ways of orienting. Like, does a market in your state do a cool vendor orientation and you don't have one yet at your market? Go see if they'll let you like sit in on it or something. So just the like sharing of ideas, I think, is really powerful. I know Amanda and Mallory have some thoughts on this too.
Mallory, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm going to go back to the data for a second and just talk about how what I've learned is that there's really not a good average farmers market vendor. It does not exist. There's just far too much diversity in the types of operations, farms, producers that come to that market for too many different kinds of purposes. And that is what makes farmers markets, I think, really interesting to study and learn from. And one thing that we observed, vendor retention is kind of critical to this entire project, right? How can we help markets retain, support, recruit, keep new and beginning vendors? How can we see these businesses launch and be successful? Even if they leave the market and they're still successful, that's a success, but how do we help them look at that? And we finally had 2 years of data to compare because we did 2019 and 2020. Now our 2020 data is unique because of the pandemic, but we saw that the vendors that did come back as a group, they had higher sales the previous year than the vendors who chose not to come back. So there is this self-sorting process that's happening at the farmers market already. Makes sense, right? But we still feel that on the margins, market managers have a role to play to support vendors to make that year as successful as possible so that they are more likely to return and come back. And what we saw from the vendors who appeared at our markets in 2020 but were not there in 2019, as a group, those new vendors they had much lower sales than the returning vendors. And so something that we're watching very closely is, okay, you came to the farmers market, you didn't have a very good year during 2020. Please, will you give it a chance again in 2021? That's something we've got our eye on as we watch these markets reopen and see who comes back. And I believe that because of all of the efforts of the group, I think the vendors at the markets that have been in the network and participating in trainings are going to have more of a support. And some of the stuff that we have done has been, Amanda can talk a lot more about this and I'll turn it over to her very soon, but it almost is very easy. Like Kelly said, it's not creating brand new systems or structures, but it's being intentional. It's creating space for conversations, and it's raising awareness. And just as an outsider sitting in on these calls, that's kind of what I've picked up, and I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Yeah, I think that I was a market manager too for 10 years before I came to doing this, and the job often felt isolated. If you're the only staff person at the market, it can just be really closed in. Like, you don't have people to bounce ideas off. You want to support your vendors, but you also don't want to like be sharing a bunch of like, not totally sure if this is going to work, or how, like, you don't want to. So like, just having other market managers to talk to and learn from and see how they are doing things, and get inspired by what they're doing, and have their successes inform what you want to do with your market. You can go back to your board and be like, hey, this is what's happening at the Sisters Farmers Market or at the Albany Farmers Market. Let's try this. That can be really reinforcing when you're trying to make change at your market. Yeah, I think I'm really excited for the Farmers Market Learning Network, that we're headed into just being able to support people with having a community to talk to and not feel alone in the work that you're doing, and make some big changes at the market. I cannot wait to be doing this call with you again in like 3 years and telling you what we've seen happen.
Maura, I will say too that one of the funniest things that we learned from our surveys, from surveying the market managers and the vendors, about like vendors being like, asking the vendors, what do you wish your market manager would do more of to support you? And asking the market managers, like, what kind of trainings do you think you need for your vendors to get better at growing their own businesses? And the market managers always thought the vendors needed to be doing more marketing, and the vendors always thought that the market managers needed to be marketing them more, as we discussed earlier. But what we found was that at some of the markets where the market managers were doing demonstrably the most to market their vendors, the vendors actually were seeing the value of being marketed, and they were some of the ones that had the highest rates of, my market manager needs to be marketing me more. So one of the things that we learned is, like, market vendors always want to be marketed. So if you're thinking about how to support your vendors in a way that makes them feel supported, then like marketing is a really good go-to. So if you're like, what's my like entry level, like, what can I do to start supporting my vendors better? Like, having clear handbooks and rules, doing a new vendor orientation, and then featuring them in some of your marketing, such as social media and stuff like that. Those are like really low-hanging fruit, we found. Amanda, anything else strategy-wise that we noted that was concrete?
No, that's excellent advice. I worked in the cooperative grocery industry for a long time, and I was a market manager for 3 years. And I can really see the overlap in both of those both of those separate entities. I mean, they're really similar, where you have individual unique products that you need to highlight to customers, and how do you do that? And as a market manager, your vendors are, they're not your employees. You're kind of co-working together, but they need to feel supported by you, just as employees in a department in a grocery store need to feel supported by their manager. And again, to me, that all comes back around to that trust. And it sounds like, through this current project that you're working on and your new one, all of those aspects of it are just designed ultimately to increase that trust between the board, the market manager, the vendors, and the customers. So yes, Amanda, I'm very excited to have this conversation again in 3 years and do a follow-up. That would be wonderful. So, well, I think that this has been a really great conversation. If there isn't any other, last pieces of advice or final thoughts, we can close it out. And I thank all of you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information can be found in the notes. And please leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. We'd also appreciate it if you could fill out a brief survey to tell us what you thought of the podcast. It helps us improve our content. A link to the survey is included in the notes. I'm your host, Rich Myers. Alan Puckett and I produce ATTRA Voices from the Field at the National Center for Appropriate Technologies headquarters in Butte, Montana, with support from the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the view of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.